At Augsburg, on the 10th of May, 1945, American interrogators sat down with Hermann Göring in a schoolroom that had been converted into an interview suite. They had a long list of questions. One of them was when, exactly, did he first know the Luftwaffe was losing the air war over Germany? Göring did not hedge. He gave an answer that has been reproduced almost verbatim in every subsequent history of the air war, though seldom in his original words. He said, when the American long-range fighters were able to escort the bombers as far as Hanover, and it was not long until they got to Berlin. We then knew we must develop the jet planes. The popular paraphrase of that moment, the one most people know, is shorter and more famous. The day I saw the Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up. The phrase has the ring of something Göring would have said. There is no primary transcript that records him saying it in those exact words. What the official United States Air Force in Europe intelligence summary of his interrogation does record, in third person, is that he had been stunned by the first evidence that British and American single-engined fighters were flying over German soil for hours at a time. Long-range fighter escort, the summary noted, came to him as a complete surprise. When fighters actually appeared over Berlin for the first time, he knew the eventual results would be tragic. That admission, made under interrogation in a defeated country in the spring of 1945, is the starting point of this story. Because 18 months earlier, in the autumn of 1943, the proposition that an American single-engined fighter could reach Berlin and fight there was, by every calculation his own technical staff had made, mathematically impossible. The aircraft that proved them wrong did not yet exist in the form that would matter. It was being built, in pieces, by people who in many cases did not know each other and were not formally working on the same problem. And the man whose name had been a joke to the Berliners since the autumn of 1940 was about to discover that the joke had a tail. In September of 1939, addressing Luftwaffe officers shortly after the invasion of Poland, Göring made the kind of promise men in his position should never make. He said that if even one British bomber reached the Ruhr Valley, his name would no longer be Göring, it would be Meyer. Meyer is one of the most common surnames in Germany, the equivalent of Smith or Jones in English. The German idiom, ich will Meyer heißen, means roughly, I will eat my hat. Göring was telling his audience that the idea of a British bomber reaching the German industrial heartland was so absurd that he would change his identity to that of a German everyman if it ever happened. The line was bravado. Within a year it was being thrown back at him. By the autumn of 1940, when the first Royal Air Force night raids began reaching German cities, Berliners had started calling the air raid sirens Meyer's hunting horns, a layered joke that played on Göring's official title as Reich Master of the Hunt. The man who had promised the Reich was untouchable was now, in popular speech, the man with the hunting horns that wailed at night. But what is interesting about the boast is not the bravado. It is that Göring, for years, had a real technical reason to believe what he was saying. The math behind it was not in dispute. Berlin sits roughly 560 miles from the airfields of eastern England by the most direct route. Flying that distance, dropping bombs, fighting off interceptors, and returning requires an extraordinary fuel load. The bombers of 1941 and 1942 could just barely make the trip, and only at night, when British area bombing doctrine relied on darkness for protection. The American 8th Air Force, when it arrived in England in 1942, intended to do something different. It intended to fly precision daylight raids in tight formations of heavily armed B-17s, hit specific factories, and fly home. The whole theory rested on one assumption, that the bombers could defend themselves with their own machine guns. Within a year, that assumption would be tested almost to destruction. The German technical staff had run the numbers on every Allied fighter type that could plausibly escort those bombers. The Spitfire, the best dogfighter in the British inventory, had a combat radius of about 175 miles with a slipper tank, less without. It could escort to the German border and not a foot further. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavy American fighter built around an enormous radial engine, had longer reach but still nothing close to Berlin even with drop tanks. The P-38 Lightning, the American twin-engined interceptor, was theoretically capable of greater range but was scarce, mechanically temperamental, and suffered chronic engine trouble at the high altitudes the bombers flew at. None of these aircraft could reach Berlin, fight for 15 minutes, and come home. The German staff drew a circle on their maps around eastern England. Beyond that circle, the bombers would always have to fly alone. Beyond that circle, every twin-engined Messerschmitt with rocket tubes under its wings, every Focke-Wulf with the heavy armor plating developed for ramming bomber formations, every cannon-equipped night fighter pressed into daylight service, would have an undefended target. Berlin was at the deepest point of that protected airspace, 600 miles inside the line. The Reich was a fortress with a moat made of distance. The 8th Air Force tested the depth of that moat on the 14th of October, 1943. It sent 291 B-17s to attack the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, deep in southern Germany. The escorting P-47s were not equipped with drop tanks that day, and even with the small 75-gallon tanks then available, their range fell well short of the target. They broke off near Aachen, on the German border, leaving the bombers to fight the next 200 miles alone. The Luftwaffe was waiting. 60 B-17s were shot down. Another 17 were so badly damaged they had to be scrapped. 121 returned with significant battle damage. 650 American airmen were killed, captured, or missing in a single afternoon. The Americans called it Black Thursday. Inside the German Air Ministry, Black Thursday was a vindication. The Reich was untouchable in daylight. 20% loss rates were what unescorted American bombers got when they tried to reach southern Germany. What the German staff could not see, on the evening of the 14th of October, was that the same loss rate that vindicated their doctrine was a slow death sentence for the bomber campaign. The official Army Air Force's history would later admit, in its own words, that the 8th Air Force had for the time being lost air superiority over Germany. Deep penetration raids were suspended. For the rest of 1943, the 8th flew its missions to targets in France, in the Low Countries, in the Ruhr Valley, places where existing fighter escort could reach. The 100th Bomb Group, the Bloody 100th, had lost 12 of 13 B-17s 4 days earlier on a mission to Münster. Only the airplane flown by Robert Rosenthal had returned from that one. The 306th Bomb Group, on Black Thursday alone, lost 100 men. The morale of the 8th Air Force was not just shaken, it was teetering. The combined bomber offensive, authorized at Casablanca in January of 1943, with the explicit objective of destroying the Luftwaffe before the planned cross-channel invasion, was failing. And without command of the air over France, there could be no invasion. Schweinfurt was not a bad day. It was a strategic crisis. What no one in the German Air Ministry knew, on the evening of Black Thursday, was that an aircraft had been in flight testing in California for almost 3 years that would, within 5 months, render their entire calculation obsolete. The story of how that aircraft came to exist begins with a polite refusal in a Manhattan office in April of 1940. The British in the spring of 1940 were desperate. France was about to fall, the Battle of Britain had not yet begun, and the Royal Air Force needed fighters faster than British factories could produce them. A British purchasing commission was sent to the United States to buy whatever was available. They walked into the offices of North American Aviation and asked the company's president, a West Virginia-born engineer named James Howard Kindleberger, known to everyone as Dutch, to build them more Curtiss P-40 Tomahawks under license. The P-40 was the standard American Army fighter of the moment, competent if unspectacular, and Curtiss could not produce them quickly enough. Kindleberger said no. He told the British he could design them a better aircraft in roughly the same time it would take North American to retool for a Curtiss license. The British, with nothing to lose, took him at his word. Kindleberger promised a prototype in 120 days. The man Kindleberger handed the project to was a German-born engineer named Edgar Schmued. Schmued held Austrian citizenship through his father, but he had been born on the 30th of December, 1899, in Hornbach, in the southwestern fringe of the German Empire, near the Lorraine border. His father was a dentist. He had served briefly in the Austro-Hungarian aviation troops, the Kaiserliche und Königliche Luftfahrtruppen, during the First World War as a mechanic. He had no university degree in engineering. He had taught himself, by reading, by apprenticing in small engine factories, by building things and watching them either work or fail, He had emigrated through Brazil to the United States in 1930, joined the Fokker Aircraft Corporation of America, which was reorganized first as General Aviation and then in 1934 as North American Aviation, and by 1936 was preliminary design engineer at the company's Los Angeles plant. The man who had been asked to design a fighter capable of defeating the Luftwaffe was a self-taught German immigrant who had grown up reading the same engineering journals as the men who would later design the Messerschmitts he was about to face. Schmued and his small team worked at a pace that even by wartime standards is hard to comprehend. The first prototype, designated NA-73X, was rolled out of the hangar in Inglewood on the 9th of September, 1940, by Schmued's count 117 days from the start of the design work. By the contract signing date, it was closer to 102. It flew for the first time on the 26th of October. The aircraft had several features that set it apart from anything else the Americans were producing. It used a low-drag airfoil section developed jointly by North American and the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, the so-called laminar flow wing. In production, surface imperfections, paint, dirt, rivets, and field damage meant the wing rarely sustained true laminar airflow, but the thin section still gave a meaningful drag reduction at high speed. The radiator was placed unusually far back on the fuselage in a duct that Schmued's aerodynamicist, Edward Hawkey, working with the wind tunnel team at the California Institute of Technology, had deliberately designed to exploit a phenomenon known as the Meredith effect, first published by F. W. Meredith of the Royal Aircraft Establishment in 1935. Heated air leaving the radiator produced a small amount of forward thrust that partially offset cooling drag. The principle was already in use on the Spitfire. What was new on the Mustang was the magnitude of the recovery, which exceeded predictions. The aircraft carried an enormous internal fuel load, and it was clean. Where the P-40 had been a rugged, blunt instrument, the new aircraft was long, lean, and aerodynamically refined in ways that a self-taught engineer who had spent 25 years studying the problem could see, and that more conventionally trained engineers had missed. There was one problem. The Allison V1710 engine that powered the early Mustang performed adequately at low altitudes but ran out of breath above 20,000 feet. Its supercharger was a single-stage design. At the altitudes where the war over Germany would actually be fought, between 25 and 35,000 feet, the Allison simply did not produce enough power. The British took delivery of the early Mustangs in 1941, used them for low-level reconnaissance and ground attack work, and concluded that the airframe was excellent, but the engine was not suited to the job that would matter. As an escort fighter at altitude, the Allison Mustang was not capable. It could not reach Berlin at fighting altitude at all. On the 30th of April, 1942, Rolls Royce's senior liaison test pilot at Hucknall, Ronnie Harker, flew Mustang AG-422 at the Air Fighting Development Unit at Duxford. Harker climbed out of the cockpit and wrote a memorandum that would change the air war over Europe. He suggested that the Mustang airframe should be married to the Rolls Royce Merlin engine, specifically the Merlin 60 series, which had a two-stage, two-speed supercharger and produced its rated power at 30,000 feet. The British engineering establishment took the suggestion seriously. By the autumn of 1942, a Merlin-powered prototype was in the air. The performance was a transformation. At 30,000 feet, the Merlin Mustang reached 440 miles per hour, almost 100 faster than the Allison version at the same altitude. It outpaced the Spitfire that shared the engine. The Americans, when they saw the test results, ordered Packard in Detroit to begin license building Merlins to American manufacturing tolerances. The production version, designated the P-51B, began rolling off the line at Inglewood and at a new plant in Dallas in the summer of 1943. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Hitchcock, the assistant air attaché at the United States Embassy in London, championed the Merlin marriage with the United States Army Air Forces when his own service had largely ignored the airplane. But the engine alone did not make the Mustang a Berlin Escort. What made it a Berlin Escort was a piece of equipment that almost no one ever talks about. It was a fuel tank. To be exact, 3 fuel tanks. The Mustang already carried more internal fuel than any other single-engined fighter in the world, around 184 gallons in its wing tanks. North American engineers added an 85-gallon tank behind the pilot's seat. The aircraft handled badly with that tank full, the center of gravity shifting dangerously aft, but pilots learned to burn the fuselage tank first, before engaging in combat, after which the airplane handled normally. To this internal capacity could be added 2 external drop tanks, originally 75 gallons each, later upgraded to 108 gallons. With a full fuel load and the larger drop tanks, the Merlin Mustang could fly up to 850 miles into enemy territory in maximum range configuration, fight and return. That number was the number that broke the German calculation. Berlin was 560 miles from the Mustang's English bases. The moat had been crossed. The first long-range Mustang escort missions were already happening before the Luftwaffe noticed. On the 13th of December, 1943, P-51s of the 354th Fighter Group, based at Boxted, flew a round trip of about 490 miles to Kiel, the longest fighter escort of the European war up to that point. The Luftwaffe response was confused. German pilots reported encountering single-engined fighters at distances where single-engined fighters could not exist. Some assumed the contacts had been Spitfires that became disoriented and flew the wrong way. Others guessed they were a new variant of the P-47 that had somehow extended its range. The Mustangs were not yet appearing in numbers large enough to force the High Command to revise its assumptions. That changed because of a decision made by a single man, in a single conversation, at the headquarters of the 8th Fighter Command at Bushey Hall in early January of 1944. In late 1943, Lieutenant General Ira Eker, the commander of the 8th Air Force, was reassigned to the Mediterranean. His replacement was Major General James Harold Doolittle, the same Doolittle who had led the Tokyo raid in April of 1942 and who had commanded American air forces in North Africa and Italy. Doolittle arrived in England in early January and went to visit his subordinate, Major General William Kepner, who commanded the 8th Fighter Component. Doolittle walked into Kepner's headquarters at Bushey Hall and saw a sign on the wall. The sign read, "The first duty of the 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive." Doolittle stopped, read it, and asked who had put it there. Kepner said it had been there when he arrived. Doolittle told him to take it down and replace it with another. The replacement read, "The first duty of the 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters." The change was not cosmetic. Under the old doctrine, escort fighters flew close formation with the bombers, weaving above them, burning fuel they could not afford, waiting for the Luftwaffe to come to them. Under the new doctrine, the fighters were ordered to range ahead of the bombers, to dive on German airfields where interceptors were forming up, to chase damaged Luftwaffe aircraft down to their bases and shoot them up on the runways. The bombers were now bait. The escort fighters were now hunters. Doolittle later said this was the most important decision he made in the entire war. He also said, paraphrasing Adolf Galland, the head of the German fighter arm, that the day they took the fighters off the bombers and put them against the German fighters, that is, went from defensive to offensive, was the day Germany lost the air war. Galland made the same analytical point throughout his memoir, The First and the Last, in his own words. The two men, on opposite sides, agreed on what had happened. The Mustangs began arriving at the operational squadrons in late January and early February of 1944. The 354th Fighter Group, originally a 9th Air Force tactical unit, assigned the mission of supporting the planned cross-channel invasion, had been the first American unit to receive Mustangs in November of 1943. They were based at Boxted in Essex, and on the 1st of December they flew a fighter sweep over France with their new aircraft. Within 10 days they were flying their first escort missions for the 8th Air Force, which had no Mustangs of its own at the time, and quietly co-opted the 9th Mustang Group for strategic escort work. The 354th's pilots called themselves the Pioneer Mustangs. The bomber crews who saw them at altitude, glinting bare metal at 30,000 feet, called them the Little Friends. The nickname stuck. Every veteran of the 8th Air Force bomber campaign for the rest of his life would refer to escort fighters as the Little Friends, even decades later, even when the men who had flown those fighters were dead and the airplanes were in museums. The 4th Fighter Group at Debden, commanded by Colonel Donald Blakesley, received its first Mustangs in mid-February 1944 and flew its first combat mission on the new aircraft on the 28th. Blakesley told his pilots they would learn to fly the airplane on the way to the target. Some had less than an hour of cockpit time when they took it on a combat mission. In the week before the Berlin raid, the 8th Air Force launched the operation that would become known as Big Week, an all-out attack on the German aircraft industry from the 20th to the 25th of February 1944. The objective, set by General Karl Spaatz in concert with Doolittle, was to destroy the factories that produced German fighters and to force the Luftwaffe up to defend them, where the new American escorts could destroy the interceptors in the air. Big Week was costly. The 8th lost 97 B-17s and 40 B-24s. The 15th Air Force, flying from Italy, lost 90 bombers. But the Luftwaffe lost roughly 260 fighters in air combat and a third of its serviceable fighter strength overall, together with pilots it could not replace. Big Week did not destroy German fighter production. The factories were dispersed and rebuilt with extraordinary speed. What it did was exactly what Doolittle had intended. It pulled the Luftwaffe up into the air and let the Mustangs kill it. 4 days after the end of Big Week, on the 4th of March, 1944, the 4th Fighter Group escorted a force of B-17s and B-24s toward Berlin. It was the first time American single-engined fighters had attempted the 1,100-mile round trip to the German capital. The weather was terrible. Most of the bomber force was recalled. A small number of bombers and their Mustang escorts pushed through. They reached the outskirts of the city and turned for home. It was a partial mission, but the precedent was set. A young Mustang pilot of the 357th Fighter Group named Charles Yeager, flying his first combat mission 3 days earlier, was already with the 8th. 2 days after the 4th of March mission, on the 6th, the 8th Air Force launched what its records remember as Black Monday. 730 bombers were dispatched. 658 reached the target area, escorted by more than 800 fighters of all types, including a substantial force of Mustangs flying the entire route. 69 bombers were shot down, the heaviest single-day loss in the 8th's history. But the Mustangs had gone all the way. They were over Berlin, in daylight, fighting Fokker-Wulfs and Messerschmitts at 30,000 feet, and coming home with combat fuel to spare. The actual combat that day was a confused, sprawling, day-long sequence of engagements, stretching from the Dutch coast to Berlin and back. The German fighter controllers had hours of warning. Units were scrambled from airfields across Germany, Holland, Belgium, and northern France. The first major engagement happened over Haselünne in northwestern Germany around midday. As the bombers approached Berlin, Major Thomas Hayes of the 357th Fighter Group, leading 33 Mustangs, arrived in the target area just as Major Hans Kogler's 7 twin-engined Messerschmitt 110s, followed by 41 Messerschmitt 410s of Zerstruge Schwede 26 and 76 and 72 Messerschmitt 109s, were forming up to attack the bombers from the right. By chance, the geometry of the rendezvous put Hayes's Mustangs in a position to spring a trap. The 357th dove into the German formation. Hayes turned into 4 Messerschmitt 109s and engaged. The 4th Fighter Group, the Debden Eagles, claimed 15 aircraft destroyed in what its veterans afterward called the unit's first big day. Lieutenants Howell and Carder of the 357th, on the way home, shot down a single Messerschmitt 109 over Bremen and killed its pilot. Oberleutnant Gerhard Luce of Jägerschwader 54, a German ace credited with 92 air victories. Total Luftwaffe losses for the day from the bomber-destroyer wings alone, the units built specifically to ram and rocket American bomber formations, came to 16 aircraft, 8 of them shot down by Mustangs. The bomber-destroyers had been built around the assumption of unescorted bombers. They had not been built around the assumption that single-engined American fighters would be flying with the formations all the way to Berlin and waiting for them. Within 10 days, on the 16th of March, Mustangs and Thunderbolts engaged the Messerschmitt 410 units defending Augsburg in southern Germany. Of 43 German bomber-destroyers that took off, only 10 returned undamaged. The 410 was Hitler's favorite anti-bomber design. By the end of March, it had been removed from daylight operations. The doctrine of using heavily armed twin-engined fighters to ram bomber formations from outside the range of escort fire, the doctrine that had killed 60 B-17s at Schweinfurt 5 months earlier, was finished. Adolf Galland later described his own moment of realization in The First and the Last. On a clear spring day in 1944, flying a Focke-Wulf 190 over Magdeburg in east-central Germany, Galland attacked a formation of B-17s. 4 escorting Mustangs immediately came after him. He could not outrun them. He could not turn with them. He was a Luftwaffe lieutenant general flying alone in an aircraft that had just been outmatched. So he tried something he had used before in tight spots. He fired his guns forward, into empty air. The streams of smoke and the spent cartridge cases tumbling behind his Focke-Wulf produced, to the pursuing Americans, the illusion of an aircraft firing on them from behind. The 4 Mustangs broke off into a climbing turn to clear what they thought was a threat to their own tails, and Galland escaped. He landed and reported what he had seen. The pretense that had been holding the Luftwaffe's planning together for 2 years collapsed within days. Galland had been telling the Air Ministry for months that the Allies were developing a long-range escort capability. As early as the summer of 1943, Luftwaffe pilots had reported encountering American fighters at distances that should have been impossible. Galland, who had spent his entire career as a fighter pilot, passed the reports up the chain. The technical staff dismissed them. The pilots, the staff said, must have been mistaken about their position. The math had not changed, the staff said, and therefore the reality reported by the pilots could not be what it appeared to be. This was not unique to the Luftwaffe. It is the standard pathology of any organization in which the people who do the work are not trusted by the people who run it. But in the Luftwaffe of 1943 and 44, the pathology had become acute. Göring had publicly committed himself to the proposition that the Reich was beyond the reach of escort fighters. To admit the proposition was wrong was to admit he had been wrong, and Göring was not a man who admitted being wrong. The technical staff sensed what their boss wanted to hear and kept telling him. The pilots in the field, who knew better, watched their training fields turn into hunting grounds and watched their friends die. There is a deeper irony in the story that the post-war German memoirs mostly avoided. The Luftwaffe had begun the war with a long-range escort fighter of its own, the Messerschmitt 110, a twin-engined heavy fighter built specifically for the role. During the Battle of Britain in 1940, the 110 had been so badly outclassed by Spitfires and Hurricanes that the German fighter pilots assigned to escort it called the situation a disaster. By the end of 1940, the 110 had been pulled from daytime escort duty and reassigned, ironically, to the role of bomber-destroyer, the role in which it would be slaughtered by Mustangs 4 years later over Augsburg. The lesson the Luftwaffe drew from the failure of the 110 was that long-range single-engined escort was simply not possible. The Messerschmitt 109, the standard German single-engined fighter, had even shorter legs than the Spitfire. Galland later wrote that during the Battle of Britain, his fighters had so little fuel reserve over southern England that the cockpit fuel warning light would come on while they were still in combat over Kent. That experience hardened into doctrine. The Germans concluded that single-engined fighters could not provide deep escort, and they stopped trying. They put their development resources into bigger interceptors and faster bomber-destroyers. They never developed an equivalent of the rear fuselage tank, the ferry tanks, and the high-capacity drop tanks that the Americans bolted onto the Mustang. They could have. The technology was not exotic. The British had used drop tanks on biplane fighters before the war, and German designers knew about them. What was missing was not the engineering. It was the will to revisit a conclusion that had been reached and filed away. Galland in his memoir wrote that he repeatedly requested that the Messerschmitt 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190 be fitted with larger drop tanks for offensive operations. The requests were not refused on technical grounds, they were refused on doctrinal grounds. The Reich had been declared defensible. Long-range fighters were what the enemy had. They were not what Germany needed. And by the time the doctrine was visibly wrong, the production system was so committed to building short-range interceptors and bomber-destroyers in maximum numbers that no rapid pivot was possible. The factories had been dispersed by Allied bombing. The fuel had been bombed. The airfields had been strafed. The pilots had been killed. The system that should have produced a German Mustang in 1942 had spent its capacity, instead, on producing more of what had already failed. The Mustang's arrival was catastrophic for a reason that had nothing to do with the aircraft itself. The Luftwaffe had built its fighter force around the assumption that the deep interior of the Reich was sanctuary. Pilots who survived their first combat tours over France or the Channel could be rotated back to airfields in Germany itself, where they trained new pilots and flew only when forced to scramble against bomber raids that would always be limited in duration by the bomber's fuel constraints. The interior of Germany was where you learned to fly. It was not where you were supposed to die. When the Mustangs arrived, the interior of Germany became the most dangerous airspace in Europe. The training fields became hunting grounds. The bases where new pilots were learning instrument flight, basic gunnery, and formation tactics were now within range of fighters that had been ordered specifically by Doolittle to find German airfields and shoot them up. New pilots who had not completed their training were being killed before they ever flew an operational mission. The veteran instructors, the men with 3 or 4 years of experience who were the seed corn of the entire German fighter force, were being killed when they scrambled to defend their own bases. The Luftwaffe in the spring and early summer of 1944 was not just losing a battle, it was losing its ability to produce more pilots. It was losing its ability to train the pilots it had. The attrition curve, which had been steep since 1942, became almost vertical. Major General Orville Anderson, Deputy Commander for Operations of the 8th Air Force, later assessed that the P-51 had played a decisive role in the air war over Western Europe. General Henry Arnold, the commanding general of the Army Air Forces, wrote in his memoir Global Mission that one of the great miracles of the war was the appearance of the long-range fighter escort over Germany at the saving moment. A 1944 finding by the Senate War Investigating Committee, chaired by a Missouri senator named Harry Truman, called the Mustang the most aerodynamically perfect pursuit plane in existence. By the end of 1944, 14 of the 15 fighter groups in the 8th Air Force were flying Mustangs. The single holdout, Colonel Hubert Zemke's 56th Fighter Group, kept its P-47s by preference. The Luftwaffe Day fighter force had been bled almost to extinction. By the morning of D-Day, the 6th of June, 1944, the Luftwaffe could mount only about 130 fighter sorties across the entire invasion area. The most famous response was a single strafing pass over Sword Beach by Hauptmann Josef Priller, the commander of Jagdgeschwader 26, and his wingman, in 2 Fokker Wolfs. There were other actions that morning, including the destruction of 4 Royal Air Force Lancasters by a 4-aircraft element under Helmut Eberspacher, but the total effort against an Allied force of more than 10,000 aircraft was negligible. The fighter arm Göring had built had ceased, in any meaningful operational sense, to exist. Göring himself, in the United States Air Force in Europe interrogation at Augsburg on the 10th of May, 1945, conducted by General Karl Spaatz and his team, and in further United States strategic bombing survey sessions at Augsburg and at Mondorf in Luxembourg through May and June, was direct about what had happened in a way he had never been in public. He said the reason for the failure of the Luftwaffe was the success of the American Air Forces in producing a long-range escort fighter that allowed the bombers to penetrate deep into Reich territory and still have constant strong fighter cover. Without that escort, he said, the air offensive would never have succeeded. He named the Mustang specifically. He credited it with delivering what the interrogators recorded as a major strategic blow to German planning. The summary of his interrogation noted, in third person, that he was stunned by the first evidence that British and American single-engined fighters could fly over German soil for hours at a time. It was, he said, completely outside his expectations. What is most striking about reading the interrogation now, 80 years later, is what Göring did not blame. He did not, in those private sessions, blame Allied numerical superiority as much as his post-war memoirists would. He did not blame Hitler for the loss of the air war as much as the standard German general's narrative would later. He blamed the Mustang. He blamed the engineering decision that produced it. He blamed his own technical staff for failing to anticipate that a long-range escort fighter was even possible. The calculation his own air ministry had made told him the moat was uncrossable, and the calculation had been wrong. The man whose name had been a joke to the Berliners since the autumn of 1940 understood, looking at the contrails over his country, that there would be no recovery from this. The Mustang, as it appeared over Berlin on the 6th of March, 1944, was not the work of any single person. Schmued designed the airframe. Hawkey tuned the radiator duct that gave it its uncanny efficiency. Kindleberger refused the British P-40 contract and bet his company on a clean sheet design. Harker wrote the memorandum that married the airframe to the Merlin. Hitchcock championed the marriage with an American service that had been ignoring the airplane. The Packard engineers in Detroit license built the British engine to American manufacturing tolerances. The North American engineers added the rear fuselage tank that put Berlin within reach. Doolittle wrote the order that turned the escorts into hunters. Blakesley at Debden had his pilots flying the new aircraft into combat with less than an hour in the cockpit. The squadron pilots, most of them young men who had been taught to fly in trainers 10 years older than the war they were fighting, learned to handle a thoroughbred at 440 miles per hour at 30,000 feet and went out and used it. The standard story of the air war over Europe is told as a contest between American industrial production and German technical excellence. That framing misses the point. It was a contest between an open system and a closed one. The Americans and the British, throughout the war, did the embarrassing thing of admitting when their assumptions were wrong. They built Allison Mustangs, found out the engine was insufficient at altitude, and married the airframe to a foreign engine. They built P-38s with insufficient drop tank capacity and added external tanks. They sent bombers to Schweinfurt, lost 60 in an afternoon, and concluded that unescorted daylight bombing was unsustainable, then poured resources into solving the escort problem. The Germans by 1943 could not do this. Bringing bad news upward in their political system was professionally and sometimes personally dangerous. The technical staff that had concluded American long-range escort was impossible could not easily revise that conclusion when reality contradicted it, because the man at the top, who had built his credibility on the original conclusion, did not want to hear it. Hermann Göring is not a man who deserves much sympathy from history. He was a thief, a glutton, a morphine addict, a willing participant in the regime's worst crimes, and a coward at the end. But the moment in the spring of 1944 when he understood what had happened in the air over his country was one of the more honest moments of his life. He did not retreat into the comforting fiction his own staff was about to try to feed him. He looked at the contrails and understood that the calculation his ministry had spent 2 years defending was wrong. The fortress had no moat. The Dollar Army had built something his own technical establishment had told him was impossible, and they had built it in numbers. Whatever was going to happen next was already decided. The aircraft he was looking at, the P-51B Mustang, would account for roughly 4,950 enemy aircraft in the European theatre by the end of the war, more than any other American fighter, the figure including both air-to-air victories and aircraft destroyed on the ground. By the spring of 1945, when the 8th Air Force flew its last bomber missions, Mustangs were ranging as far as Polish and Silesian targets, with a combat radius longer than the bombers they were escorting. The Luftwaffe at the moment of German surrender had something close to 3,000 combat aircraft still on its rolls, and almost no fuel to fly them with, and almost no trained pilots left to put in the cockpits. The men who had been flying Messerschmitt 109s over France in the summer of 1940 had, by and large, been killed. The German answer to the Mustang, when it came, was the answer Göring had told Spaatz about at Augsburg. The Luftwaffe turned to jet aircraft. The Messerschmitt 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, entered combat in the summer of 1944 with Erprobungskommando 262 and later with Jagdgeschwader 7 and the elite Jagdverband 44 under Galland himself. It was faster than any Allied piston-engined fighter by 120 miles per hour. In a clean fight at altitude, it could not be caught by anything the 8th Air Force had. But it had 2 fatal weaknesses. Its Junkers Jumo 004 axial flow engines required careful nursing by their pilots and were vulnerable to throttle changes. And the aircraft itself was at its most vulnerable on takeoff and landing, when it was slow and committed. American pilots learned quickly. They orbited German jet bases at altitude and dove on the Tu-62s as they came into land, when their pilots had no power and no options. By the time the war ended in May of 1945, the German jet program had produced a remarkable aircraft and had no operational ability to use it. The pilots who could have flown it were dead. The fuel that could have powered it had been bombed out of existence. The airfields it could have flown from were under constant Mustang patrol. Edgar Schmued went home to Oceanside, California, where he lived quietly and worked as a consultant until his death on the 1st of June, 1985. Ronnie Harker continued at Rolls Royce until he retired in 1971 and died in 1999. Donald Blakesley survived the war, retired from the Air Force as a colonel, and died on the 3rd of September, 2008, at the age of 90. James Doolittle lived to 96, dying on the 27th of September, 1993. He was promoted to 4-star general by President Reagan on the 4th of April, 1985, 26 years after he had retired. Hermann Göring was sentenced to death at Nuremberg on the 1st of October, 1946, and committed suicide with a smuggled cyanide capsule the night before his scheduled execution. Adolf Galland, who had escaped the Mustangs over Magdeburg in the spring of 1944 by a piece of quick thinking and a stream of empty cannon smoke, lived until 1996, ran a flying school in Argentina after the war, and remained close friends until his death with the American and British airmen who had spent 4 years trying to kill him. The squadron pilots who flew Mustangs over Berlin in the early months of 1944, the men who were 22 and 23 years old in the cockpits over Karin Hall and Brandenburg and the Tempelhof flak fields, mostly went home and went back to ordinary work and did not talk about it much. They had crossed a line on a map that the men on the other side had spent their careers explaining could not be crossed.